Torren Yule was the kind of man you wouldn't notice twice. Quiet, clean-cut, and polite enough to make you forget he existed. Fendrel Wint, his only known associate, was even less memorable. A recluse who lived on the edges of society, hidden beneath layers of dust and silence. But together, these two ordinary men orchestrated one of the most horrifying murder operations the country had ever seen. An operation that stayed hidden in plain sight, sealed in vacuum packs, and delivered under the cover of something as innocent as a Big Mac meal. It was a bitterly cold February evening in Devlin, Ohio. The kind of night where most people stayed indoors, tucked away from the biting wind. But for Kasha Bloom, a 19-year-old college student working the evening shift at the McDonald's, the night had just begun. She had been behind the drive-through window for a few hours, handing out Happy Meals and Big Macs with her usual, forced smile. Business was slow, and the atmosphere inside the restaurant was sleepy. The hum of the soda machine was louder than the customers. Around 9:42 p.m., a black sedan with tinted windows pulled into the drive-through lane. Kasha noticed it right away, not because of its make or model, but because of how it approached the speaker. It didn't stop to look at the menu or hesitate while ordering. The voice that came through was low, almost mechanical, and asked for a Big Mac meal with no pickles, large fries, and a Diet Coke. There was no small talk, no confusion, no hesitation. It was robotic and unsettling. When the car rolled up to weigh her window, Kasha reached out with the bag and cup, but the driver didn't immediately take it. He stared straight ahead, his face barely visible behind the shadow of a hood in the window tint. When he finally turned, their eyes met for just a second. Kasha felt a coldness that had nothing to do with the weather. His eyes were empty, completely, devoid of emotion, like a person seeing through her rather than at her. As he took the bag, Kasha caught a strong chemical smell wafting from inside the car. It wasn't a normal car scent. It smelled like bleach and something else she couldn't identify, something rotten. She recoiled slightly, trying to mask her reaction, but it was already imprinted in her mind. The odor lingered as the car slowly pulled away without a word. Most people sped off or thanked her. This man didn't do either. She stood there for a moment, her hand still half out the window, staring at the taillights as the sedan merged into the dark road. She wasn't a paranoid person, but something about this interaction clung to her like frost on glass. It felt wrong. She turned to her coworker, a supervisor named Alma, and mentioned the smell. Alma brushed it off, saying sometimes meat deliveries leaked or old cars just smelled weird. But Kasha couldn't let it go. She had a habit of scribbling down license plates whenever something felt off. A strange hobby, born out of true crime documentaries and late-night anxiety. She went to the counter, grabbed a receipt, and wrote the first 5 characters she'd caught from the sedan's license plate. GXM 82. The rest of her shift passed without incident, but her mind kept drifting back to that car. She tried to shake it off, chalking it up to an overactive imagination. After all, people were strange all the time. It didn't mean anything. Still, as she locked up at the end of the night and stepped into the frozen parking lot, she glanced around more than usual. Her own car, an old Corolla, took longer than usual to warm up, and the frost-covered windshield forced her to drive slow. As she pulled out, she took one more look at the road where the black sedan had disappeared hours earlier. 3 nights later, news broke that a young woman named Moira Keene had gone missing only 2 blocks from the McDonald's. The timing chilled Kasha to her core. Moira was last seen walking home from her shift at a coffee shop near the drive-thru. The timeline fit too perfectly. Kasha immediately called the police tip line. She gave them everything: her suspicion, the car, the smell, the partial plate. She didn't know then that her decision would become the crack in a case far more horrifying than anyone in Devlin had imagined. A case that would unfold in chilling layers, one happy meal at a time. Moira Keene had always been known as reliable. At just 19 years old, she worked long hours at a local coffee shop, balancing her time between saving for community college and helping her younger brother with his homework. So when she didn't come home on February 12th, her mother called the police within hours. At first, it was treated as a routine missing person report. The officer on duty made the usual notes, suggested she might have gone to stay with a friend, and promised to follow up. But those who knew Moira were certain this wasn't something she would do. It wasn't the first case to raise concern. Only 10 days earlier, Elra Vint, a 22-year-old nursing assistant, had vanished on her way home from a late-night shift at the Rivervale Care Center. Her phone was found in a snowbank near the bus stop, but there were no signs of struggle and no witnesses. The town had whispered, but no one had connected the dots. Yet. Detective Renzo Thale was the kind of investigator who preferred the quiet details. He had worked dozens of missing persons cases over the years, most of them eventually closed without incident. But something about Elra's case had bothered him from the beginning. When Moira disappeared under eerily similar circumstances, he knew it wasn't coincidence. Both women were young, lived within 30 miles of each other, and worked late shifts that left them vulnerable. Both vanished in the evening, after dark, while walking alone. Their last known locations were eerily close to chain restaurants or convenience stores. In Moira's case, her final phone ping was logged just 100 feet from the McHarlan McDonald's. Thale visited the McDonald's 2 days after Moira was reported missing. He asked to speak to the night shift crew and was directed to Kasha Bloom. She recognized the detective's name from the local news and immediately brought up the black sedan and her lingering suspicion. When she handed over the crumpled receipt, with the partial license plate, Thale took it without a word. She told him about the smell, the man's face, and how he never said a single word. Most people would have dismissed her story. Thale didn't. He requested security footage from surrounding businesses. The McDonald's cameras only showed blurry outlines of the sedan, useless footage thanks to the outdated system. But a gas station down the road had a more modern setup. One of its cameras captured a black car circling the area 3 separate times between 8:30 p.m. and 9:45 p.m. The last time, it pulled into a side lot and stayed parked for nearly 20 minutes. Thale dug deeper. He ran searches for registered vehicles that partially matched the plate number Kasha provided. Over a dozen possibilities came up, but only one stood out: a 2012 black sedan registered to a Torren Yule. The address led to a rural property on the outskirts of Devlin, bordered by trees and largely hidden from view. Thale made a note to visit. Meanwhile, news of Moira's disappearance began to spread across local media. Flyers went up, volunteer search parties formed, and Moira's mother appeared on the evening news pleading for her daughter's safe return. The community was shaken, but the fear hadn't yet turned to panic. That changed when an abandoned shoe, Moira's, confirmed by her family, was found in a ditch less than half a mile from the McDonald's. The laces were torn, the sole scuffed. It was a grim sign. Not long after, a stray dog brought home a piece of fabric that matched the apron she had worn to work that day. It had been shredded, stained with something dark. This wasn't a runaway. It was something else. By the time the sun set on that second week, Renzo Thale was certain. There was a predator moving through Devlin and its neighboring towns. A predator who hunted young women under the cover of night, blending into everyday routines, using common places as stalking grounds. And now, with a partial plate, a black sedan, and a growing trail of evidence, Thale was about to get closer to a name. But he had no idea just how much horror was waiting behind the man he was about to meet. The address linked to the black sedan led Detective Renzo Thale to a property tucked away behind rows of leafless trees and a rusted wire fence. The mailbox bore the faded name Yule. It matched the vehicle registration for Torren Yule, a man with no previous criminal record, no social media presence, and no close family ties on file. The house itself was an aging two-story structure with peeling gray paint and blackout curtains drawn across every window. A half-collapsed shed sat in the back, partially hidden behind a stack of firewood and rotting lumber. Everything about the property suggested seclusion by design. Thale arrived with a warrant, supported by the partial license plate, security footage, and the proximity to the location where Moira Keene's phone had last pinged. Officers surrounded the house just before dawn, ensuring no one could slip out unnoticed. When they knocked on the door, there was no response. After a few tense minutes, they forced entry. Inside, the air was stale and unnaturally clean. There was no clutter, no personal items, no signs of life beyond the basic furniture. Every surface appeared recently scrubbed. The walls were bare, no photos, no decorations, not even dust on the bookshelves. It was as if someone had deliberately erased their presence. The kitchen was pristine. The bathroom shined with bleach. Yet, oddly, there were no dishes in the sink. No food in the fridge beyond a few protein shakes and canned goods. Not even a toothbrush in the bathroom. It didn't feel lived in. It felt staged. The basement was locked. When they pried the door open, it revealed more of the same. A sterile space with only a folding chair and a flashlight resting on the floor. But in the corner, officers found a dark smudge on the concrete. A preliminary test confirmed it was blood. It had been partially cleaned, but not well enough. Out back, Thale examined the shed. The door was chained and padlocked. The rusted chain clanged as they cut through it. When the door finally swung open, the stench hit them immediately. Rotting. Flesh, bleach, and meat. The shed was dimly lit and lined with shelves of old tools and plastic containers. But the centerpiece was a large, commercial-style meat locker humming in the far corner. It looked out of place in the otherwise neglected structure. The locker was sealed tight with a second lock, which they quickly broke. Inside, they found rows of vacuum-sealed packages, some labeled as cuts of pork or beef. At first glance, it looked like typical frozen meat. But the cuts were irregular, some too large, others shaped unnaturally. When a medical examiner arrived, the truth became horrifyingly clear. The packages contained human remains, limbs, torsos, even sections of skin. Some of the tissue had been treated with preservatives used in the meat industry. This wasn't the work of someone panicking. It was the work of someone methodical. Dental records confirmed the worst. Among the remains were the bodies of both Moira Keene and Elra Vint. Identification was possible only through teeth and fragments of bone. The rest had been stripped, shaved, and processed. The killer had taken time, too much time to package. His victims as though they were part of a grotesque inventory. Torren Yule was nowhere to be found. A warrant for his arrest was issued and the manhunt began. His workplace confirmed he hadn't shown up for 2 days. Co-workers described him as quiet and strange, but never violent. He kept to himself, worked long hours, and never engaged in conversation beyond what was necessary. A few mentioned that he always volunteered to handle the discarded meat and cleanup jobs that others avoided. Authorities began searching every meat locker in the surrounding counties, fearing there could be more. Forensic teams dug up parts of the yard behind Yule's house and found burial sites. 4 more, in fact. Each shallow grave held plastic-wrapped remains. None of the victims were immediately identifiable. What stunned investigators most wasn't just the brutality, but the cold organization behind it. Torren hadn't killed out of impulse. He had a system, a routine. He blended into the background while performing acts so horrific they challenged even the most seasoned detectives. Devlin was no longer a quiet town. It had become the center of a nightmare, and they had only just begun to understand the depth of it. With the gruesome discovery at the Yule property now public knowledge, a wave of shock swept across the region. News vans flooded the small town of Devlin, reporters crowding around police barricades and desperate families calling hotlines, fearing their missing loved ones might be among the unidentified remains. The name Torren Yule became a symbol of calculated horror. A man no one had truly seen, though he'd lived among them for years. Authorities expanded the search radius to include nearby towns and counties. The FBI joined the investigation. But the one person everyone wanted was still missing. Detective Renzo Thale couldn't sleep. His mind looped through everything they'd uncovered. The meat locker, the vacuum-sealed packages, the basement bloodstain, the carefully erased presents. It was all intentional. Torren hadn't just killed. He'd taken pleasure in turning the aftermath into a performance, a hidden narrative written in plastic and silence. But where was he now? The answer came from a surprising place, a McDonald's worker 2 towns over, who claimed she had seen someone matching Torren's description come through the drive-thru late one night. He'd ordered the same thing, a Big Mac meal, no pickles, large fries, and a Diet Coke. He hadn't spoken. He never made eye contact. The black sedan was gone, but the pattern remained. The tip sent Thale and a tactical team racing toward the area. They began cross-referencing traffic cameras, toll booth records, and surveillance footage from convenience stores. Eventually, they traced a vehicle rented under a fake name to a cheap roadside motel in the outskirts of Kessler County. The room was booked for a week, paid in cash. The motel manager said the guest barely came out except at night and never allowed cleaning service inside. That night, a surveillance team was dispatched. Hours passed. No movement. Then, just after midnight, a figure stepped out of the motel, room wearing a hood and gloves. He carried a duffel bag and moved with mechanical precision. Thale watched from the unmarked car as officers moved in. The arrest was quick, silent, and without struggle. Torren didn't resist. He didn't even blink. In custody, he remained unresponsive, refusing to speak, eat, or react to questioning. A forensic psychologist was brought in to assess him, but Torren's emotional readings were flat. No signs of fear, remorse, or confusion. Just a void. His silence created a chilling sense of control, as if he was still writing the rules of the narrative even from inside a cell. Back at the crime scene, deeper analysis of his belongings revealed even darker secrets. Among the contents of his duffel bag were carefully labeled journals. Not diaries, but inventories. Each victim had a file, documented with precise notes: height, weight, estimated yield, methods of disposal, emotional reactions during abduction, and how long they took to die. These weren't trophies. They were clinical observations, like those of a butcher cataloging livestock. One file, however, was different. It didn't have a name or a photo, just a number. Subject: 11. The description was shorter, the handwriting sloppier, as if it had been written in haste. The file ended mid-sentence. It was the only one not sealed in plastic. Investigators were puzzled until they noticed the date scribbled in the corner, just 3 days before his arrest. Subject 11 had never been accounted for. A new search was launched across the area surrounding the motel. Cadaver dogs were brought in, and then, in a drainage pipe half a mile from the motel, they found her, alive. A young woman, bruised and weak, but breathing. Her name was Melia Rorn. She had been missing for 6 days. Somehow, she had escaped before Torren could complete whatever grim process he had planned. She had crawled through the forest, hidden by day, and survived on snow and rainwater until she collapsed near the pipe. Melia's rescue turned the case upside down. She became the living key to understanding how Torren operated. Her account was fragmentary but horrifying. She remembered the smell of chemicals, a locked basement, and the sound of meat being cut. She had played dead to avoid being selected next. Her survival proved that Torren wasn't invincible. But it also proved something far more disturbing. He was accelerating. Each victim had been taken closer together, the timeline shrinking. Melia had interrupted that cycle. And now the real question emerged. Was Torren acting alone, or had someone else been helping him stay ahead all this time? Amelia Roarn's survival changed everything. Up until that moment, the investigation into Torren Yule had been focused on one man, an isolated predator hiding in plain sight. But Amelia's account suggested otherwise. Through broken whispers and trembling words, she described sounds from above the basement, footsteps heavier than Torren's, voices speaking briefly, and once, laughter. It wasn't just her captor. Someone else had been in the house. Someone Torren had trusted enough to bring into his horrifying process. Detective Renzo Thale, already exhausted and burdened by the weight of the case, now faced an even darker possibility. Torren Yule might have been the architect of the crimes, but there was every indication he wasn't the only one behind the machinery. The journals, while detailed, had gaps. Several victim profiles lacked certain entries, details someone else may have recorded or supplied. And then there was the meat locker. The setup was too extensive, too specialized for a man who had no known training in butchery or food preservation. Someone had taught him, or worked alongside him. Investigators combed through Torren's financials and property records again, this time with sharper focus. One name kept reappearing: Fendrel Wint, a former meat processing plant technician who had briefly shared a P.O. box with Torren 5 years ago. Fendrel had disappeared from public records shortly afterward, quitting his job and selling his small home for cash. His last known address was a trailer near the state line, deep in an unmonitored stretch of wooded land. Authorities launched a quiet surveillance operation. The trailer sat in silence for 2 days. On the third, movement was detected. Someone dragging a large bag to a burn barrel out back. When agents closed in, Fendrel tried to flee through the trees, but was quickly apprehended. Inside the trailer, what they found was not just confirmation of his involvement, but evidence of a more extensive operation. Walls covered in diagrams, lists of names and towns, even maps with red circles around isolated bus stops and convenience stores. Victims had been scouted, chosen carefully, and catalogued. Fendrel had acted as a scout, a planner, and in some cases, a disposal specialist. He confessed to parts of the operation, but insisted that Torren was the true orchestrator. According to Fendrel, they had met in an online forum dedicated to wilderness, self-sufficiency. But it was never about survival. It was about control, about the slow transformation of a person into a product, hidden behind the language of harvesting and efficiency. Fendrel claimed that Torren believed people could be processed if emotion was removed, if morality was erased from the equation. And disturbingly, Fendrel had gone along with it. With both men now in custody, authorities worked to identify the final victims. The burial sites behind Torren's house yielded 6 sets of remains. 3 were matched to missing persons from nearby counties. The others were still being analyzed, but likely dated back nearly a decade. It became clear that this had not started recently. Torren and Fendrel had been doing this for years, quietly, carefully, methodically. Public outcry followed. Candlelight. Vigils were held for the victims. The governor called for sweeping reforms to tracking missing adults. Local police departments across the region re-examined cold cases with renewed urgency. Amelia Roarn was hospitalized for weeks, slowly regaining strength. Her testimony, though limited, was enough to seal the case. But she remained haunted, unable to sleep without lights on, her mind looping through the sounds and shadows of the basement that nearly became her tomb. Torren Yule never spoke. Even during trial, he sat expressionless, staring blankly ahead. He was sentenced to life without parole, as was Fendrel Wint. No appeals were filed. There was nothing to argue. The evidence was overwhelming. Years later, documentaries would retell the case under chilling titles, each focusing on different aspects: the meat locker, the journals, the escape. But the one phrase that stuck in the public's memory came from Kasia Bloom, the McDonald's worker whose small act of reporting had unraveled it all. In an interview, she said, "I knew he had more than a Big Mac meal. I just didn't know. It was people." And that's how the case came to be known. They knew he had more than a Big Mac meal. A reminder that monsters don't always hide in the dark. Sometimes they order from the dollar menu.